Hello, I'm Jake Boudrot, Civic Journalist at Tello Community Television. In this episode of Strait Talk, warning preparedness meteorologist with the Canadian Hurricane Center, Bob Robichaud, gave a media briefing on the tropical storm and hurricane season in Atlantic Canada. After the briefing, he answered my questions about the upcoming season in this region and what people should do to prepare.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this year's hurricane briefing. I'm going to follow the same sort of template as I usually follow in these briefings, and that usually starts with a look at the previous hurricane season. So, if we look at the predictions that were issued last year in May, right around this time, actually. We were looking at 17 to 25 named storms. We were predicting a very active season. And we did get a very active season with 18 named storms, 11 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes that impacted areas in North America. So the forecast last year worked out very, very well. We had a number of very impactful storms. We had, unfortunately, a number of fatalities during last year's hurricane season. Here in Canada, we had one storm that actually entered our response zone as a tropical as a tropical system, and that was Ernesto in August. We did have some indirect impacts, specifically from storms like Debbie, that enhanced rainfall over parts of southern Quebec and caused extensive flooding in that area. So it's always good to look at what the factors influencing hurricane season are at the current time, and then look back at last year and see how they've evolved over time. So last year, when we were predicting this very active season, we were looking at very warm, even near record water temperatures in the Atlantic, which really help fuel these types of storms. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, we were in a neutral, we weren't in a La Nina or El Nino condition in the Pacific. We know that La Nina conditions typically result in more tropical cyclones in the Atlantic. So we were kind of in between last year in what we call a neutral condition there. But despite that, we were expecting that busy season given the warm waters in the Atlantic. So that was last year at exactly this date last year. So if we go forward and look at this year, really what stands out is the record warmth that we saw last year in the Atlantic is no longer there this year. Water temperatures in the Atlantic are somewhat overall warmer than the long-term average, but much closer to that average than they were last year. Also in the Pacific, again, we're in kind of a neutral condition there. So not necessarily any influence from El Nino or La Nina for this hurricane season. So that's all fine for now. The important thing is how these things are going to evolve over hurricane season, and what the important factors are in terms of these influencing factors are what they're going to be once we reach the peak of hurricane season, which is August, September, and October. So taking all that into consideration, so next slide, please. These are some of the numbers from the experts that predict seasonal hurricane activity. NOAA came out with their outlook yesterday and are calling for 13 to 19 named storms. Of those, 6 to 10 would become hurricanes, and 3 to 5 would become major hurricanes. There's a number of different agencies and private companies who actually issue seasonal outlooks. Another one that we look at quite a bit is Colorado State in the US, and they're calling for very similar numbers as NOAA indicated yesterday. And you can see how that compares to last year, and also how that compares to the long-term 30-year average that we currently use to compare some of these hurricane seasons. So now the question is, what does this mean for Canada? We monitor all storms that are in the Atlantic at the Canadian Hurricane Center, but we only message on those that have potential impacts here in Canada. And this is our response zone, where we start tracking storms about 3 days prior to entering this area. So what we like to look at is look at the number of storms that enter our response zone compared to, say, the overall total number of storms in the Atlantic. So this is updated from last year. So last year we only had that one storm, even though we had indirect impacts from some other storms. Really, the only storm last year was Ernesto. So the percentage of storms entering our response zone last year was low. But overall, if you look at the average, we typically get about 35 to 40% of the storms that form in the Atlantic somehow find their way into our response zone. So we can count on typically three to two to four hurricanes or tropical storms that will enter our response zone on any given year. Not all of those will have impacts on land. And like we saw last year, sometimes they can have indirect impacts. But that's kind of what we look at in terms of the number of storms potentially impacting Canada. So again, hurricane season starts June 1st and extends right up until the end of November. And the peak of hurricane season is the month of September, but those shoulder months as well, August and October, tend to be quite busy as well. So the peak of hurricane season is really from early August until the end of October. That's where we really get the bulk of our activity. So next slide. So the names that we're going to be using this year, this is, for the most part, the list that we used back in 2019. So the first name storm this year will be Andrea, followed by Barry, Chantal, and then we have Dexter. We all pretty much remember hurricane and post-tropical storm Dorian that had major impacts here in Canada in 2019. That name was retired from the list and was replaced by Dexter. So Dexter, whenever we have Dexter this year, that is the name that replaced Dorian from 6 years ago. So final slide, please. So again, hurricane season starts next week. It's time to get prepared for it if we're not prepared already. There's a variety of ways you can get our weather information, either on our WeatherCan app, on our website, and for more information on how to get prepared for these types of storms, go to getprepared.ca.
Merci beaucoup, Bob. We will continue with the question period. Nous poursuivons à la période de questions. To ask your question via Zoom, please use the hand-raising function, or by phone, press *9 followed by *6 to unmute yourself. To be called upon, we ask that you make sure your name and your media outlet are clearly identified in your Zoom name. We ask you to keep it to one question and one follow-up. Veuillez utiliser la fonction lever les mains si vous avez une question sur votre téléphone. Veuillez appuyer *9 suivi par *6 pour établir le son. Pour poser une question, nous vous demandons de vous assurer que votre nom et votre média soient clairement identifiés dans votre nom Zoom. The first question is from Michael McDonald. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks for doing this, Bob. I just had a couple questions. I'm wondering if you could expand on this idea that a prediction of an active season doesn't necessarily mean a higher risk of impact and damage and that sort of thing.
What the prediction actually addresses is it looks at the larger scale processes in the atmosphere that determine not just the atmosphere, but obviously the ocean as well. But it determines the overall level activity. That is a predictable thing. So we can actually predict that. Where these storms go is another thing entirely. That depends on the weather of the day, and that is something that really we have to have a storm in place on the map, really, to know the weather conditions of the day, to determine where the storm might go, how strong it might be, and what the impacts might be. A good example is if we look at the 2023 hurricane season, we had 2 more storms than we had last year, yet the damage from last year is about $100 billion more last year with 2 fewer storms. And the same thing on the fatality side. If we look at all the countries that get affected by by these tropical cyclones, way more severe impacts last year with fewer named storms than we had in 2023. So although we can predict the level of activity, we can't necessarily predict exactly where they're going to go, if any will make landfall, and what the impacts might be. So sometimes you can have a very active season, but the storm track kind of keeps most of the storms offshore, and you have lower impacts. As for here in Canada, we've done some work to try and determine the relationship between the number of storms in the Atlantic and the correlation between the storms that enter our response zone. And there's actually the correlation is not really that strong, so it can vary from year to year. It all depends on really where these storms actually go as to what kind of impacts you're going to get.
Just a bit of a technical question. I understand that you talked about La Nina and La Nino being a neutral year, but I'm given to understand that that means less wind shear in the upper atmosphere, and that could actually lead to fewer hurricanes falling apart and making it all the way across. Can you talk about that?
When we are in a La Nina situation, that weakens some of the lower winds in the Atlantic, so that you end up with less wind shear during a La Nina year than you would have in say a neutral, or certainly an El Nino year. So right now, since we're in a neutral, we're not getting a strong influence from either La Nina or El Nino. We're kind of somewhere in between. So overall, if you look at the entire season, again, we're talking about averages in terms of the amount of wind shear that we see. But we see during the actual season that it kind of the amount of wind shear increases, and then it decreases. It increases and decreases. So it's in those windows where the wind shear actually decreases that we can have a lot of these storms developing one after the other, and it can get quite busy within a short period of time. So right now, the influence from the Pacific side is neither La Nina or El Nino, which would mean about average amount of wind shear.
La prochaine question est va être Ira Morellon, Radio-Canada.
Que les prévisions cette année ont été plus difficiles pour vous, étant donné des coupures à la NOAA aux États-Unis? Je sais que ça avait été une inquiétude lorsque ça avait été annoncé. Je me demande si ça a eu des effets sur vos prévisions.
Il faut préciser que les prévisions que j'ai discutées tantôt, c'est des prévisions essentiellement qui viennent d'autres organismes. Nous, on fait pas de prévisions. On fait des prévisions sur les tempêtes spécifiques qui vont entrer dans notre zone d'intervention. Par contre, on ne fait pas de prévisions nécessairement sur l'échelle saisonnière. Donc, on regarde les autres prévisions qui sont émises, mais nous, on ne produit pas nos propres prévisions, du moins du côté des prévisions de saison. Il y a, à l'heure actuelle, il y a au-dessus de 20 organismes qui essaient de prévoir le nombre de tempêtes qu'il va y avoir dans l'Atlantique. Et les chiffres certainement varient beaucoup, mais la NOAA et l'Université de Colorado State sont les deux qu'on regarde de plus près.
Et juste pour suivre, justement, vu que c'est celle que vous suivez de plus près, quand vous avez appris qu'il allait y avoir des coupures de ce côté, est-ce que vous avez pensé à réévaluer peut-être les organismes que vous alliez observer, ou est-ce que ça reste quand même très fiable dans les prédictions?
Nos capacités n'ont pas changé du tout. Les communications qu'on a avec le Centre de prévision des ouragans à Miami restent ouvertes. Il n'y a pas nécessairement eu de coupure dans ce centre-là. Ils nous ont indiqué que le plan opérationnel international pour les ouragans, parce qu'il y a plusieurs pays qui peuvent être affectés par ces genres de tempêtes-là. Dans les Caraïbes, les États-Unis, le Canada, donc ils ont un plan international qu'on suit, puis ils nous ont bien indiqué qu'il n'y allait avoir aucun changement majeur dans ce plan-là.
The next question will go to Jacob Moore, Acadia Broadcasting. Go ahead, Jacob.
I was just wondering if you could talk about how climate change may or may not be driving up the average amount of hurricanes we're getting?
So at least globally, we're not seeing an increase in the number of storms each year, but what we are seeing is an increase in intensity. So a larger proportion of storms that are reaching the major hurricane status, the categories 3 to 5. And that is something we expect to continue with further warming as well. Maybe I'll also add with climate change, we're also seeing increased rain rates. So the storms we're getting have more rainfall. And of course, sea level rise also exacerbates any storm surge or coastal flooding concerns.
The next question, la prochaine question va être de Agas Boucard de Radio-Canada.
Ma question, c'est, vous avez rappelé à plusieurs reprises l'importance de bien se préparer aux ouragans, mais il y a toujours des gens qui sont sans toit après la tempête Fiona qui a été la plus coûteuse de l'histoire du Canada Atlantique. Alors j'aimerais savoir comment est-ce qu'on se prépare mieux?
Le processus de se préparer, c'est de connaître les risques. Les activités de préparation individuelle vont dépendre des risques qu'on a dans notre vie et dans notre lieu de travail, à la maison, toutes ces choses-là. Donc, la première chose de faire, c'est de comprendre les risques qu'on peut avoir quand ces genres de tempêtes-là nous approchent. Donc, on sait que bien souvent, quand on a des tempêtes de nature tropicale qui approchent nos côtes, on peut avoir des inondations le long de la côte, on a des quantités de précipitations très fortes. Des fois, ça peut occasionner des évacuations. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour se préparer pour une évacuation, par exemple? Un autre exemple, ce serait qu'il y a beaucoup de gens dans l'Est du Canada qui sont sur des puits à la maison. Donc, si on a une panne de courant, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire pour obtenir de l'eau? Il faut avoir un plan. Et pour avoir un plan, il faut vraiment connaître les risques qu'on a dans notre situation spécifique. C'est certain qu'on avise aux gens d'avoir des trousses d'urgence, toujours de près, pas juste pour la saison d'ouragan, mais au cours de l'année, de toute l'année. Mais vraiment, pour avoir un bon plan d'urgence pour les ouragans ou quoi que ce soit, quelle urgence que ce soit, il faut connaître les risques. Ça, c'est la première chose à faire. Et il y a tout un processus là, pour suivre que vous pouvez trouver sur préparez-vous.gc.ca.
Merci. J'ai peut-être une question de suivi. Est-ce que vous pourriez réexpliquer un petit peu pourquoi une saison très active des ouragans, ça ne veut pas forcément dire qu'il y aura des dommages importants?
Oui, parce qu'on peut avoir une situation où les conditions sont propices pour avoir beaucoup de tempêtes dans l'Atlantique, mais ça dépend énormément où ces tempêtes-là vont aller. Ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on ne peut pas prévoir à l'échelle saisonnière comme qu'on le fait aujourd'hui. Donc, on peut quand même prévoir le niveau d'activité dans l'ensemble du bassin atlantique, mais on ne peut pas prévoir où ces tempêtes-là vont aller. Donc, ça, on peut avoir des situations où on a beaucoup de tempêtes, on a des tempêtes très fortes, mais ces tempêtes-là ont une trajectoire qui affecte peu de gens, donc ça limite les impacts. C'est pour ça qu'on ne peut pas prévoir nécessairement qu'il va y avoir de gros impacts, même si possiblement ça va être une saison plus active.
La prochaine question, ça va être Ariane Kroll de La Presse.
J'aimerais savoir un peu dans la continuité de la question précédente, le fait que l'eau de l'océan soit un peu de l'Atlantique moins chaude que les 2 dernières saisons, est-ce que ça fait qu'on est un peu moins nerveux, un peu moins sur les dents concernant le risque qu'on ait des ouragans très dommageables ou très spectaculaires?
Pas vraiment, parce que vraiment, là, l'exemple à cette question-là, l'exemple que j'utilise beaucoup, c'est en 92. En 92, on a seulement eu environ 6 tempêtes nommées cette année. Cette année-là, en 92. Si on compare ça au nombre de tempêtes qu'on voit durant les dernières années. 6, c'est très, très peu de tempêtes. Mais la première tempête cette année-là, c'était l'ouragan Andrew, qui est un ouragan catégorie 5 qui a frappé le sud de la Floride. Un autre exemple plus récent, ce serait Fiona en 2022. Cette année-là, Fiona était la seule tempête qui a frappé le Canada, mais c'était la plus importante tempête de nature tropicale qui a jamais frappé le Canada. Donc, vraiment, euh, ça nous aide de communiquer l'idée que ça n'en prend juste une tempête pour que ça soit une mauvaise saison. Dans une saison qu'on prévoit là, jusqu'à possiblement 19 tempêtes nommées, même si les températures de l'eau sont moins chaudes que les 2 dernières années, c'est pas quelque chose qu'on peut regarder et dire ça sera pas on devrait être moins inquiet. C'est pas vraiment une question d'être inquiète, c'est plus une question d'être préparé pour possiblement une tempête qui pourrait nous causer des problèmes.
Merci. Si je peux poser une sous-question. Pouvez-vous juste un petit peu requalifier là, Déby l'année dernière, elle n'était pas dans votre zone de surveillance, mais évidemment, nous, au Québec, on a vu les dégâts qu'elle a fait. Comment ça se qualifie une tempête comme ça, qui n'est pas dans la seule, qui est comme Eduardo, là, qui était dans votre zone de surveillance?
C'est ça. Vraiment, qu'est-ce qu'on suit? On suit toutes les tempêtes qui sont dans le bassin atlantique. Mais il y a une transition qui arrive bien souvent avec ces tempêtes-là, quand ce qui se dirige vers le nord, ils deviennent des tempêtes, qu'est-ce qu'on appelle post-tropicales. Donc, il y a une période de transition quand ce que la tempête va de nature complètement tropicale à une tempête qui est post-tropicale. La différence entre les deux, c'est que c'est le mécanisme qui gouverne l'intensité de la tempête est très différent. Dans le cas des ouragans, c'est l'eau chaude l'eau chaude et le cisaillement des vents qui gouvernent l'intensité, tandis que d'une tempête post-tropicale, c'est plus les différences de température de l'air entre le nord et le sud. Donc, quand on a une tempête qui devient post-tropicale au sud de notre zone d'intervention, on traite cette tempête-là comme une tempête extratropicale normale. Donc, la même structure qu'une tempête hivernale, par exemple. Sauf qu'on n'a pas de neige, on a de la pluie. Donc, on n'a pas vraiment besoin nécessairement de l'expertise du Centre canadien de prévision des ouragans pour prévoir ce genre de tempête-là, parce que la tempête est plus comme une tempête d'hiver. Donc, si la transition se fait bien au sud, c'est là que nous, on se retire un peu de la situation, malgré qu'on peut avoir des quantités d'humidité très importantes et des pluies extrêmes et les dégâts comme qu'on a vu l'année passée.
Okay, the next question will go to CBC Nova Scotia.
I did want to ask what the increased intensity in storms means for recovery for the province, considering there were large storms from 2019 and in the years since then. With the increased severity, what can we expect for the province in terms of recovering from larger, bigger, stronger storms?
Regardless of where these storms have impacts, whether it could be the Caribbean, it could be the United States, it could be here in Canada. This year is going to mark the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And in a lot of respects, they are still recovering from that. So these things are very, very impactful storms, and they cause a lot of damage, and it takes a very, very long time to recover from them. One of the things here in Nova Scotia, as you probably know, they have a new Department of Emergency Management. So they're putting a lot of focus on not only the recovery aspect, but the preparation and the response to some of these major events. And I work very, very closely with the Department of Emergency Management. I'm actually embedded within their operation. So we work extremely in close collaboration when it comes to dealing with these storms or any kind of major event.
can you talk a bit about what kind of prep goes into sort of preparing for the storms ahead of time, considering they're getting stronger and they're becoming more severe when they do make landfall across the Caribbean, the Americas?
Sure. Yeah. As I was saying in French earlier, really we can tell people to get an emergency kit and get all the supplies that you need in case you need to leave your home or in case there's a power outage. Things like having battery powered radios, extra clothing, some cash on hand, all that sort of thing. But really, to really get prepared for some of these more extreme events, it's really important to know your risks, and it might be different for everybody. If someone is on a well, for example, a power outage will mean something very different for that person as opposed to someone who is not and continues to have water in their home. People living near the coastline, if there is a significant storm surge and coastal flooding, what are they going to do? Could they be at risk? Could they be asked to actually evacuate from that area? If so, where are they going to go? Those are the kind of things that should be considered now, not as the storm is approaching, not when the storm is actually on the map. So the first part is really to know your risks, and then from there you can start working at mitigating those risks and coming up with a plan of what to do in your specific situation.
Okay, the next question will go to Mitchell Bailey, Global News. Mitchell Bailey, go ahead.
Hi there. Sorry if this was mentioned earlier, but would you say you're anticipating an active or potentially above normal hurricane season for the Atlantic Canadian region? I understand you said a lot of it comes down to the weather of the day at that time. Do we just simply not have enough information yet to make that assessment? And just looking for an additional clarification.
Correct. What I showed really is kind of an average of how many storms enter our response zone compared to the total storms that we see in the Atlantic on a given year. And on average, since the inception of the Canadian Hurricane Center back in 1987, we typically see about 35 to 40% of the storms that form in the Atlantic enter our response zone. Now, that percentage might change from year to year. Last year, it was a low percentage given the number of storms that we had and the fact that we only had one that entered our response zone. But that's kind of as far as we can go in saying anything meaningful as to what the impacts or how many storms might affect Atlantic Canada. Because these predictions at the seasonal scale are not really predictions of where these storms are going to go or what areas are going to be affected. It's basically a prediction of the total level of activity in the Atlantic Ocean.
Joining me is the warning preparedness meteorologist with the Canadian Hurricane Center. Welcome back, Bob Robichaud.
Thank you.
So the Canadian Hurricane Center is expecting a season with quote-unquote above average tropical storm activity. Experts are predicting 13 to 19 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 5 major hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean basin. The hurricane season started June 1st and runs until November 30th. Last year, some activity was expected, but here it was quieter than in years past. So maybe you can explain what may have happened last year that would have impacted on the ground here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the important thing to outline right at out of the gate is that these predictions are, as you mentioned, for the entire basin. Where they actually go is another story altogether, and where they go are dependent on the weather systems of the day when the storm is actually there. So sometimes we get lucky and we get fewer storms, and some years the basin might not have a whole ton of storms, but we might get a larger proportion of them. So it's kind of the luck of the draw there. Last year did go down in the books as what we call a hyperactive season, very, very active in terms of tropical cyclone activity. One of the deadliest hurricane seasons, unfortunately, in the last 20 years or so. But for here in Canada, we kind of lucked out. We had one storm that actually crossed our what we call our Hurricane Center response zone, and that one was Ernesto in August. We also had a couple of storms that contributed to rainfall. So it wasn't actually tropical by the time it reached Canada, but it contributed to some heavy rainfall events, especially one in southern Quebec. Where they got a tremendous amount of rain in a short period of time and caused a lot of flooding over a largely populated area, so lots of damage there in terms of rainfall from what was left of Debbie. But so we kind of felt some of the indirect impacts, but not the full impact of a landfalling tropical weather system.
What factors were at play that made that, I guess, a less than severe or less than expected season last year?
Again, it's the weather systems that kind of steer these tropical storms and hurricanes on the day when they're there. So it just so happens that although we had a significantly above average season, when the storms were around, these steering currents were such that they did not necessarily bring them right over Canada, which again is a good thing for us because we managed to get, like I say, only one storm that entered our response zone, and we typically get about between 2 and 4 on a particular year that might enter our response zone. Not that they would all necessarily have an impact on land, but our response zone extends far out into our marine territory. So we typically get about between 2 and 4 that enter our response zone. So last year we only had that one, so we were lucky there.
So this year you're still looking at above average activity. So, and you kind of explained that. So you expect that there, based on your predictions and models, that there should be some activity this year, unlike last year, which was kind of quiet, I guess.
Yeah, well, it may be quiet this year too. Here,
Yeah.
that's what we're not able to predict, is that where those systems are going to go. But overall, looking at the conditions that exist right now in the Atlantic and also in the Pacific as well for upper level wind patterns in the Atlantic, those are largely governed by water temperature in the Pacific. Overall, it's looking like the conditions are still favorable for an above average season in the entire Atlantic, but perhaps not quite as active as the 2024 season.
So what are these factors you're looking at that are playing into what you guys are looking at, your models and your predictions?
Sure. So these storms, from a structural point of view, are different than your typical fall or winter storm. They form to take energy in the form of heat that's stored in the ocean and pump that into the atmosphere at the higher levels. So that's why these storms exist to begin with. So whenever you have warmer water temperatures in the Atlantic, like we're seeing now, that lends the capacity for more storms to develop. Another thing that we look at is whether we have an El Nino or La Nina, and that is governed by water temperature in the Pacific. So whenever we have cold water in the equatorial regions of the Pacific, of the Eastern Pacific specifically, we tend to have less wind shear in the Atlantic. And it's the opposite when we're in an El Nino condition, which is characterized by warm water in that same part of the Pacific Ocean. When we have that situation, we tend to have stronger winds in the upper levels of the atmosphere, which causes a lot of wind shear. And these hurricanes in the Atlantic are vertical in nature, so they don't like a lot of wind shear. When we get more wind shear than average, the storm gets sheared apart and really can't form. So we have fewer storms and generally weaker storms during an El Nino year. So this year is neither El Nino or La Nina. It's kind of in between, and that's what we call a neutral condition. So if you look at neutral conditions in the Pacific, if we look at warmer water temperatures in the Atlantic, that kind of lends itself to a season that is above average, but not necessarily over the top as maybe we've seen in the last few years.
Now, I know you were talking about the Atlantic Basin, which is, a pretty big area here. And in our coverage area here, which is, Richmond County, Port Hawkesbury, Strait of Canso area, I guess we're covered in that, but it's possible we could end up having more severe season than others, or it could be quieter than others just because of the vastness of this area. You're talking about an area that's quite large geographically.
Yeah, for sure. And it goes with the time scale really that we're talking about. Obviously, when a storm develops, that gives us much more capability to actually even days, perhaps a couple of weeks ahead of time, to get an idea of where these storms are going to go. That's when we really can start talking about the potential areas that could be affected. And then as the days get shorter before the expected storm arrival, then we can pin it down to a much smaller area. But if we're talking about storms over the entire season, obviously we're looking at it over a larger area as well, and we can't really go much beyond that bigger area because of the long timescales involved here.
Meteorologists at the Canadian Hurricane Center conduct 24/7 monitoring and hazard prediction year-round. They focus on storms with the potential to affect Canada and its waters, track storm paths, predict intensity, and issue warnings. They also provide information to help provincial and territorial partners and emergency management officials to lessen the impacts of tropical cyclones and hurricanes in Canadian communities. Now, you guys, in the press release, when you guys, after you gave your forecast, you mentioned the system that you guys use in predicting, and I assume what I just described there, that is the system that you guys are talking about, that you kind of touted in the press release, that it's very structured system.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have in terms of issuing bulletins on a particular storm, we have our response zone that we've defined for the last couple of decades. And our procedure is to start messaging on a storm or start issuing regularly scheduled bulletins every 6 hours, about 72 hours or 3 days prior to the storm entering our response zone. So that gives mariners and people on land, a good few days to actually start preparing for the arrival of the storm. And you mentioned our work with emergency managers. I'm co-located with the Nova Scotia Department of Emergency Management. So we work very, very closely together on all things, not just related to hurricanes, but wildfires, flooding events, and that sort of thing. So they get the up to the minute, the latest information. And we can also exchange information. We get impact information from them as well. That helps us forecast not just the weather, but the potential impacts that might be generated by a storm or a particular weather event. So those synergies are well established. In fact, I would say that here in Nova Scotia, we probably have some of the best relationships with our provincial counterparts in emergency management as any province in the country. And that's from years and years of working together.
Yes, and that coordination is vital. And when you're looking at a major weather event of any kind, or forest fires, as you're indicating, Florida flooding and things like that, and that coordination and that communication is let's face it, it's essential.
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's again a credit to the Nova Scotia Department of Emergency Management, who recognize how important weather plays into any kind of emergency that you are going to deal with. During the wildfires in 2023, I was sitting right there in the Provincial Coordination Center, and there to provide weather updates on how things were changing, things like precipitation patterns, any kind of shifts in the wind direction or wind speed. I would get questions from the Department of Health in terms of air quality. Are there going to be any hospitals in the path of the smoke that they may have to shut down their ventilation system? And having that weather expertise sitting right there with them in the Provincial Coordination Center becomes very, very important. They get that information right away and can make the best decisions possible based on that information.
On average, Environment and Climate Change Canada said 3 or 4 tropical cyclone events impact Canada each hurricane season, with 1 or 2 making impact on Canadian soil and 2 or 3 threatening offshore waters. Hurricanes are typically of greater concern later in the season, that is when the waters reach their peak warmth, as we know, that September, October kind of window. So maybe you can explain the difference between a tropical cyclone, a hurricane, and a major hurricane.
Sure. So the term tropical cyclone is sort of a generic term, like a hurricane or tropical storm is basically the same type of storm, which gets its energy from the warm water over the ocean, but it has a different intensity. So when the winds reach 63 kilometers per hour, that's when the storm is actually given a name, and then it becomes a what we call a tropical storm. If that storm continues to intensify and the winds reach 119 kilometers per hour, that storm keeps its name, but now it gets referred to as a hurricane. And then there's 5 categories of hurricanes. So tropical storm, hurricane would be like your Ford and Chevrolet, whereas tropical cyclone would be your car in terms of like the generic term. So tropical cyclone is the generic term, which includes tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes as well. And typhoons as well, for that matter, in the Pacific, which is basically the same type of storm, but we call them different names in different ocean basins. So in the Atlantic and the Eastern and Central Pacific, we call them hurricanes. In the Western Pacific, we call them typhoons, but the same exact type of storm.
Because there has been an increase in Category 3 to Category 5 hurricanes over the past 4 decades, and with climate change, the intensity of the strongest hurricanes is expected to increase, Environment and Climate Change Canada said. And they said now is more important than ever to get prepared. So how should people get prepared properly for this season?
Yeah, preparedness is very much a personal thing. I think we can talk about things like getting an emergency kit, having a go bag ready to go in case you do have to evacuate your home. Typically, evacuations occur in areas closer to the coast, like right at the coastline. For things like wind and that sort of thing, we ask people to kind of shelter in place, but we evacuate people because of water, and that's if you live near an area, a body of water, potentially fast-moving river, or along the coast. That's where you got to be ready kind of for an evacuation type event. So having those items in place in case you ever need them, but everybody's going to be different. Everybody's going to have different vulnerabilities, and if you were on a well, for example, if the power goes out, what is your backup plan for getting water? Do you have a generator? Do you have bottled water on hand? That sort of thing. So the number one thing in making preparations is determining what your situation is and coming up with a game plan for these types of situations where we know there could be flooding, there could be extended power outages, there could even be extended communication outages as well, like we saw during Fiona a couple of years ago. So being ready, evaluating your situation and coming up with a game plan is the biggest thing.
Thank you for watching Strait Talk. Please tune in again to find out what we will be talking about.